She had done this 364 times. And the 365th was no different. The sixpence on the counter, the letter beside it. The same motion, the same Monday morning mist rolling in off the Suffolk marshes and pressing itself against the receiving house glass. Prudence Larkin was 52 years old, and she had not missed a single week. Not when her hands shook with the cold, not when she could not afford bread alongside the postage, not when Alice had cried all of Sunday night with a tooth coming through, and Prudence had written the letter at 4 in the morning by a tallow stub. She set down the coin and slid the envelope forward, and Ambrose Bassett took both without looking up, because there was nothing left to look at. The queue behind her said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. And then a voice, a man's, unhurried, standing 2 places back as though he were simply next in line, which the village had not forgiven him for being, asked a question into the silence that cracked it clean open. Does he ever write back? The room did not move. Prudence kept her hand flat on the counter for a moment, feeling the grain of the wood under her palm, and then she turned. The new Baron Callender of Hexworth stood with a packet of his own under one arm and no particular expression on his face. He was not being cruel. She could see that at once. He was a large man who had spent 29 years at sea and had apparently not yet learned which questions a village had agreed not to ask. She said, "No, he does not." "I see," said Callender. He did not look away. "Then how do you know the letters arrive?" The room went very quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. The woman behind Callender shifted her basket from one arm to the other. A child near the door stopped moving. Bassett's pen did not scratch. Prudence looked at the Baron for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes. Not grief exactly, and not anger yet. Something older than either. "I have never let myself ask," she said. She took her receipt and walked out into the mist. She had not always been a woman who did not ask. There had been a time, 8 years before, when she had asked everything. She had asked the magistrate why the witnesses were not cross-examined. She had asked the solicitor why the forged signature on the enclosure award was not produced at trial. She had asked the judge, in writing, because she had not been permitted to stand in that room, whether a 19-year-old surveyor's apprentice who had found evidence of fraud against the parish was a likely thief. And she had received, in return, a form letter that contained no answer to any of her questions. Her son Jonas had been convicted at the Bury Assizes on a Tuesday in October and transported within the month. He had stood in the dock and looked at her, and she had looked back at him, and neither of them had wept, because weeping was a luxury for people whose cases were not yet decided. His sentence was 7 years. The 7 years expired this coming December. Expiry, she had since learned, was not the same as pardon. A man whose sentence expired was still, in the eyes of the law, a felon. He could not return to England under his own name without a pardon signed by the Home Office, and a pardon required a petition, and a petition required evidence of good conduct, and evidence of good conduct required correspondence. Letters from his mother attesting to his character, letters to the superintendent of the settlement, letters to the Home Office itself. She had been sending those letters every Monday for 7 years. She had a granddaughter because Jonas had married a girl in the parish 2 weeks before the assizes. Certain he would be acquitted. The girl had died of a fever when Alice was 18 months old. And Prudence had taken the child without a second thought, because Alice was Jonas's and Jonas was hers. And that was the full extent of the reasoning required. Alice was 7 now, with her father's dark eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. And she made her mark, a careful, deliberate A, at the bottom of every Monday letter. Because Prudence had told her that her father would want to know she was learning. It was Alice who noticed the Baron first, before Prudence did. "He answered my question about the tides," Alice announced one Wednesday afternoon, appearing at the back of the shop with her coat on sideways. The real answer, not the short one. "Who did?" Prudence asked without looking up from the mortar. "The man from the hall. He was at the pump. He said the moon pulls the water and the water doesn't know it's being pulled, it only knows it moves." Alice considered this. "I think that's what happens to boats." "I think you should put your coat on the right way round," Prudence said. But she looked up after Alice had gone, and she stood for a moment with the pestle in her hand. And she thought about a man who answered a child's question as though the child were a person worth answering. Miles Callender could not leave a wrong piece of paper alone. He had never been able to. It was the quality his commanders had valued most, and his social acquaintances had found most inconvenient, and it had served him well at sea and poorly everywhere else. He had inherited Hexworth Hall 2 years ago from a cousin he had met twice, and the county had received him with the particular warmth of a community that had already decided it did not want a post captain for a neighbor, and was simply waiting for him to confirm this by doing something objectionable. He had obliged by standing in the receiving house queue like any man, by speaking to his tenants as though they had opinions worth hearing, and by asking, on a Monday morning in September, whether a woman who had been posting letters for 7 years had ever received one in return. He told himself it was idle curiosity that sent him to Ipswich the following Thursday. He told himself this with some conviction for about the first 5 miles, and then he stopped telling himself anything and simply rode. The post office in Ipswich kept its forwarding records in a ledger behind the counter, and the clerk who showed it to him was cooperative in the way that men are cooperative with barons when they have nothing to hide. Callender went through the Thurlow Green entries for the past 7 years with the systematic patience of a man who had spent his career reading ship's logs. And what he found was this: no ship letter addressed to New South Wales had been forwarded from Thurlow Green in 7 years. Not one. The column where the ship stamp dates should have appeared was empty from the first week of October 7 years ago to the present Thursday. He rode back to Thurlow Green in the late afternoon with the information sitting in his chest like ballast. The apothecary's shop smelled of beeswax and dried lavender and something sharper underneath, camphor, perhaps, or the dried valerian hanging from the beam nearest the window. Prudence was behind the counter measuring something into a paper twist when the bell rang, and she looked up and saw his face before he had spoken a word, and she set the paper twist down with great care. "Tell me," she said. "I went to Ipswich," Callender said. "To the post office. I asked to see the forwarding record for Thurlow Green." "And?" He put both hands flat on the counter, which was not a gesture he had planned. "No ship letter for New South Wales has left this district in 7 years. The record is clear. There is no forwarding entry under your son's name, or any name, for that destination. Not once." She did not move. The lavender swayed very slightly in the draft from the door he had not yet closed. He reached back and closed it. "Is it a clerk's error?" she asked. Her voice was entirely level. "A gap in the record or a consistent absence?" "Consistent," he said, "and paid for. The receiving house account shows quarterly payments from an external party for 7 years. I could not determine the source from the Ipswich record, but the pattern is not accidental." Prudence looked at the paper twist on the counter. Then she picked it up and finished twisting the end closed, very precisely, and set it in the row with the others. "The Eliza Ann," she said. "When does it sail?" He had looked this up before he rode to Ipswich, because he had known, somehow, that she would ask. The 4th of November, from Deptford. The Home Office dispatch for New South Wales must be aborted, or the next ship is 9 months, and Jonas will have been reassigned inland by then. Without a pardon on that ship, he has no passage home and no legal name to carry. Prudence looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You had better come round the counter. There is a stool." 10 days later, on a Tuesday evening, Prudence Larkin stood in the parish vestry room with a letter in her hand. She had retrieved it from Bassett's counter on a pretext that morning. She had told him the direction was written wrong, and she needed to correct it. And he had handed it back without looking at her, which told her something she had not yet decided what to do with. The letter was the one she had posted the previous Monday. She held it up now in front of 14 men, including Sir Marcus Ray of Raymore in the chairman's seat, and she asked them a plain question. "This letter bears the date of the 14th of September, she said. "I paid ship rate on it. I have the receipt. It carries no ship stamp. I would like someone in this room to explain why." Ray was a tall man with a long face and the particular stillness of someone who has never needed to raise his voice. He had been chairman of the county bench for 11 years and enclosure commissioner before that. And he looked at Prudence the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has been left in the wrong room. "This meeting," he said, "is convened to discuss the repair of the north churchyard wall. You are not a ratepayer of record, Mrs. Larkin, and you have not been given the floor. My son was transported on evidence manufactured by this parish," Prudence said. "I have been paying 6pence a week for 7 years to write to him, and the letters have not left England. I am asking for an explanation." "You are asking for disorder," Ray said. He turned to the beadle. "Mr. Farrow, please see Mrs. Larkin out." The beadle, a man named Farrow, who had bought his cough medicine from Prudence's shop for 6 winters, stood up from his seat at the side of the room and walked to the door and opened it and stood beside it. He did not touch her. He simply stood with the open door and waited. Prudence looked at the 14 men. Not one of them met her eyes. Old Caro, who had known her since she was a girl, looked at the table. Denny, Callender's own steward, looked at his hands. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and walked out through the open door, unhurried, on her own feet. And that was worse to watch than anything Farrow might have done. And they all knew it. Callender stood as she passed. He was on his feet before he had decided to be, which was how most of his decisions worked. "My lord," Ray said, pleasantly and clearly, into the room behind him. "You have been in this county 2 years. You understand rather less about it than you may think." Callender looked at Ray for a moment. Then he walked out after Prudence. It had begun to rain. She was crossing the green in the direction of her shop, not hurrying, holding the letter inside her coat. He caught up with her in 3 strides and did not offer his arm or say anything about the rain, because she had not asked for either. He took off his coat instead and wrapped it around the chest of letters she was carrying. She had brought the chest as evidence, a foolish hope, so that the ink would not run. And then he walked beside her the length of the green, bareheaded in the rain, between her and every lit window, matching her pace exactly. She did not thank him. She unlocked the shop door and went in, and he followed her. And she stood behind the counter for a moment in the dark before she lit the lamp. Then she reached beneath the counter and unlocked the drawer at the bottom. "I want to show you something," she said. She lifted out a book, a large copybook, the kind used for accounts, its spine reinforced with glued linen from some earlier repair. She set it on the counter and opened it to the first page. "Every letter I have ever sent," she said. "Copied in full. Dated. I began doing it after the solicitor told me I had no documentation. I did not know what documentation I was keeping. I only knew that a woman who cannot afford an attorney can at least afford ink." Callender turned the pages. The entries ran forward in Prudence's clear, close hand. Date, direction, content, postage paid, receipt number. 364 of them. 7 years of Mondays. He stopped turning pages and looked up at her. "Mrs. Larkin," he said, "you have been keeping the best-kept evidence in England without knowing it." Something shifted in her face. Not quite relief. Because relief requires that the danger be past, and the danger was nowhere near past. But something. "Then let us use it," she said. They began that same night, in the library at Hexworth Hall, because the hall had the table space, and Prudence's back parlor did not. Callender sent his housekeeper for the receiving house's public account book, which was a matter of public record and could not be refused, and Prudence brought the copybook and the chest she had retrieved from Bassett's counter, the one she had carried across the green in the rain. They spread the letters by year along the library table and worked by lamplight, cross-referencing dates in the copybook against the account book entries, building the record of what had been sent, when, at what postage, and what the receiving house had recorded in return. Alice fell asleep on the window seat by 9 o'clock and did not wake when Callender put his coat over her, and Prudence glanced across at her granddaughter sleeping and then back at the letters and said nothing, but her hands steadied on the pages. The deadline was written in the air behind them. 4 weeks to the 4th of November. 4 weeks to get a sworn account to a commissioner, the commissioner's finding to the Home Office, and the Home Office pardon aboard the Eliza Ann before it cleared Deptford. Callender had done the arithmetic twice. It was possible. It required that nothing go wrong. He put down her sixpence before she could, the first time she came to the hall with her evening's postage in hand. She had written to the commissioner herself and wanted it sent. He laid the coin on the table and pushed her letter toward the stack. She pushed the sixpence back across the wood. Their fingers met on it for half a second. His large and rough-edged from 29 years of rope and rigging, hers stained faintly at the tips from the medicine she prepared. And she held his gaze for a moment, and then picked up the coin and put it in her own pocket. "I have been paying my own postage for 7 years," she said. "I intend to continue." He thought about that on the ride home. He thought about it the next day and the day after. He was still thinking about it 3 nights later when they were back at the library table at 2 in the morning, and she reached across him for Jonas's 9th letter, the last one in the file, the one written 3 years ago. And he put his hand over her wrist. Not to stop her. She could see that. He held her wrist with his hand flat and waited, and she understood that he was giving her the choice of when. And she sat with his hand over hers for a full minute before she picked up the letter and read it. He did not move his hand until she had finished. She set the letter down and said, "He asks whether I write." Her voice did not change. "He says he has not had a letter in 4 years, and he wonders whether I am well." Callender kept his hand where it was for a moment longer, and then moved it, and went back to the account book without speaking, because there was nothing to say that was not already said. Ray had begun to notice. Denny was suddenly and inexplicably available at every quarter session where Callender needed information, which was helpful in a way that made the back of Callender's neck prickle. Prudence's wholesale suppliers in Bury began to deliver short, a quarter pound of dried valerian instead of a full pound, A bottle of oil counted wrong. And when she wrote to query the shortfalls, no one offered an explanation. A delivery from Barry arrived one Thursday, with the seals broken and reapplied badly. And she set it on the counter and looked at it for a long moment before she put it away. Alice, who had begun to appear at the hall on her own initiative, told Callender one evening that the butcher's boy had stopped speaking to her at school. "Did he say why?" Callender asked. Alice shook her head. "No, but his father works for Mr. Ray." Callender looked at the 7-year-old across the library table and felt something harden in him that had not been hard before. It was Bassett who broke first, and in the right direction. He came to the shop at 11 at night on a Thursday, a fortnight after the vestry, and knocked at the side door. Prudence opened it, and he stood on the step with a chest at his feet, a wooden chest, banded with iron, the kind used for strong rooms. He was a small man, Bassett, with a receiving housekeeper's stoop and 7 years of guilt in his face. "I kept them," he said. "I was told to burn them. I kept them." He lifted the chest inside and set it on the counter and stood back. Prudence opened the lid. 7 years of her letters, tied in ribbon by year. The seals were unbroken. There were no ship stamps where ship stamps should have been. There was the smell of a damp back room and sealing wax and something faintly floral that she recognized as the dried lavender she had put in the first bundle 7 years ago because she had wanted them to smell of something living. And at the bottom of the chest, 9 letters in a hand she had not seen in 8 years. "He wrote," Bassett said. 9 times over the first 4 years. After that he stopped. I think he believed you had stopped first." He looked at the floor. "I kept those too. A man doesn't burn a mother's letters." Prudence stood with her hands on the lid of the chest and did not speak. Callender, who had been in the back parlor going through the account book, appeared in the doorway. He looked at the chest. He looked at Bassett. "Sir Marcus Ray," Callender said. "Quarterly payments." "Yes," Bassett said. "Since the 1st October. He came himself the first time. After that it was through his clerk." He raised his eyes to Prudence's face. "I will swear to it. The payments, the amounts, the dates. I know what swearing will cost me. I am prepared to pay it." Prudence looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. "We will take your statement in front of a witness." After he had gone, she sat down on the stool behind the counter and opened the 9th letter. The same week, the reports surfaced. They came through a contact of Callender's in the county administration, a clerk who owed him a favor from a matter of back taxes. And they showed that Denny, Callender's own steward, had been sending written accounts of their progress to Raymore for the past month. Ray knew the copybook existed. He knew about the commissioner's letter. He knew the name of the ship. He had already moved. Ray's move was clean and fast and entirely within the law, which was how he preferred to work. The charge came under the Apothecaries Act. A complaint had been filed. Ray's clerk's signature was on the covering letter, though the complaint itself was anonymous, alleging that Mrs. Prudence Larkin of Thurlow Green had been vending medicines without a current license. The petty sessions at Ipswich heard the matter in 11 minutes. Her license was revoked. Her livelihood, and Alice's, was gone at a stroke. She came home from the sessions in the early afternoon and put the shutters up and sat in the back parlor with the copybook open on her knee and did not move for a long time. Then she got up and began making a list of what she still had: the copybook, Bassett's sworn statement, the chest of letters, the account book entries. She had the commissioner's response, which had arrived the previous week and was favorable. She had Callender. Callender was leaving for London in the morning. 6 weeks of depositions, a formal hearing before the commissioner, the Home Office, and the sailing date. He needed to be there in person. The commissioner had been clear. She could not go. She had Alice. She had no money for the journey, and someone needed to remain in Thurlow Green to hold what they had built. That night, with the shutters up and the shop dark and the fire low in the parlor, she said it aloud for the first time. "There were months," she said, "when I half believed he was gone. When I thought the letters were going into the sea and Jonas was gone and I was posting them anyway, because posting was cheaper than knowing for certain." She stopped. "It cost me 6 pence a week to believe he might be alive. I could not afford the alternative." She had not cried since the assizes. She cried now, badly, the way people cry who have been holding it for 7 years. Without grace, without quiet, her whole body involved. Callender took both her hands and held them and said nothing at all, and went on saying nothing. And the silence he offered her was the most precise thing he had ever managed. He left in the morning. Alice stood at the gate and watched until his horse was gone from sight, and then turned to Prudence with her father's eyes and said, "He'll come back." Her voice was certain. "Yes, he will." 4 days later, Alice burned with fever. It came on in the night, quickly, the way fevers do with children, and Prudence sat up with her through the first night and the second and the third and the fourth, changing the cloth on her forehead and measuring the drops of medicine she still had from her own stores and watching the child's face in the lamplight. She had no shop income. She had no certainty that any letter from London had reached her. Ray's name was on the county's post routes, and she wrote to Callender twice and could not know if either letter left the district. The old terror was back, but it wore a new face now, and it sat beside her in the chair and waited. On the 5th morning, Alice's fever broke. She opened her eyes and asked for bread and butter, and Prudence went to the kitchen and made it, and stood at the window while the kettle boiled and looked out at the marshes in the early light. Nobody gave back the nights. The criminal libel writ arrived for Callender in London on a Tuesday. 2 magistrates resigned from the county bench in Ray's support within the week, which was a signal to everyone who understood how the county worked. Callender's tenants stopped meeting his steward's eye. His agent in Bury wrote to suggest that perhaps the matter might be reconsidered, which Callender read once and put in the fire. Ray's next move was Bassett's daughters. Both girls were in service, one at a house in Bury, one at an estate near Lavenham, and both were given notice on the same Friday. No reason was given. No reason needed to be given, because everyone who knew anything about the county understood perfectly what the reason was. Bassett wrote to Callender's solicitor in London the following Monday to withdraw his oath. The letter was brief and formal, and written in the hand of a man who had run out of choices. Prudence read the letter on a Wednesday evening, and then folded it and put on her coat. She walked to Bassett's cottage alone, in the dark, 2 miles along the marsh path. She knocked at his door, and he opened it, and looked at her with the face of a man who expects to be told he is damned. And she said, "May I come in?" She sat at his kitchen table and told him, plainly and without flourish, what she intended to ask the bench on his behalf when the sessions came. She told him that she would ask for clemency, publicly in front of the full gallery, and that she would ask for it because she had decided what kind of woman she intended to be, and because his daughters had done nothing wrong, and because 7 years of Mondays had cost her enough, and she was finished letting Ray decide who paid. Bassett sat across the table from her and looked at his hands. "He'll find another way to hurt them," he said. "He may," Prudence said. "But you will have done the right thing, and that will not unhappen. I cannot promise you more than that." Bassett was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All right." She walked back along the marsh path in the dark and got home at 11:30 and found Callender's horse at the gate. He had come back a day early. He was standing in the lane with his coat dusty from the road, and she was standing in front of the shop with the sign half down. She had been taking it down that afternoon, license revoked, no point in leaving it up. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and he said, "I should have been here." "You were where you needed to be," she said. He crossed the lane and stood in front of her. And then he said, in the wrong order and with half a sentence missing somewhere in the middle, "I want you to. That is, when this is done, I intend to ask, Prudence, will you marry me?" She kissed him. It was not planned, and it was not graceful, and it was entirely real. And when she stepped back, she held his face in her hands for a moment and said, "Not until it is finished. I will not have Jonas's pardon suspected of being a wife's favor bought with a title. I will not give Ray that." Callender looked at her. "Understood," he said. "Let's finish it." They went inside and went back to work. The Sessions House at Bury St. Edmunds stood at the top of the market square, its stone face gray in the October light, its gallery already full when Prudence arrived on the morning of the Michaelmas quarter sessions. 8 days remained before the Eliza Ann sailed from Deptford. The Home Office dispatch was ready. It was waiting on the outcome of this room. Ray had chosen his ground carefully. The charge was his own, vending medicines unlicensed, heard in his own venue, before a bench he had appointed over 11 years of careful management. He sat in the chairman's seat with 4 magistrates to his left and 3 to his right. And he looked at Prudence when she entered with the expression of a man who has already decided how the morning will end. She was called to answer the charge at 10 o'clock. "My lord," she said, addressing the bench, "I do not dispute that my license was revoked. I ask leave to produce evidence before this court regarding the circumstances under which that revocation was sought, and regarding a separate matter that bears directly on the administration of justice in this county." The magistrate to Ray's left, a man named Forsyth, whom Prudence had never spoken to, looked at Ray. Ray said nothing. The silence stretched for 4 seconds, and then Forsyth said, "You may produce your evidence, Mrs. Larkin." Ray's head turned very slightly. Callender stepped forward from the side of the room and set the chest on the table before the bench. He set the copybook beside it. He set the receiving house account book, marked at the relevant pages, beside that. He placed on top of the stack a sealed document. "Sworn depositions," he said, "from 3 postal clerks in Ipswich and 1 in London, attesting that no ship letter addressed to New South Wales has been forwarded from the Thurlow Green receiving house in 7 years. The account book," he opened it to the marked page, "shows quarterly payments to the receiving house keeper over the same period. The source of those payments is named in Ambrose Bassett's sworn statement, which is the document at the top of the stack." "Bassett," Ray said. It was the only word he spoke, and he said it without inflection. Ambrose Bassett stood up from the gallery bench. He was a small man, and the gallery was full, and the room was very quiet. He said, "I swear to the payments. Sir Marcus Ray's clerk delivered the first payment in October 7 years ago. Subsequent payments were quarterly. I kept the letters as instructed. I did not forward them as instructed. I did not burn them as instructed, because—" He stopped. He looked at Prudence. "Because a man doesn't burn a mother's letters." The gallery did not move. Forsyth said, "Is the schedule of payments documented, Mr. Bassett?" "It is, sir. I kept my own record." Prudence opened the copybook. "I would like to read 3 entries," she said. "The first is dated the 28th of October, 7 years ago, 3 weeks after my son's conviction." She read in a clear voice. Ray's clerk said across this counter this afternoon, while I was collecting my receipt, that the matter was settled and that I should think carefully about what I chose to remember. I have written it here because I did not know what else to do with it. She looked up. I did not know, when I wrote that I was recording evidence. I was keeping the copybook because I could not afford a solicitor. I have 364 entries. The magistrate on Ray's far right, a young man who had been appointed only the previous year, was writing. The others were still. The second entry, Prudence said, is dated the 3rd of March, 5 years ago. It records that my letter of that date, for which I paid ship rate, was returned to me 2 weeks later by Bassett on the pretext of an incorrect direction. The ship stamp that should have been applied between posting and return was absent. I noted this in the copybook and did not know what to do with the note. She paused. I know now. She put down the copybook and picked up Jonas's 9th letter. This was written by my son 3 years ago, she said. It was in the chest Mr. Bassett brought to my shop. He believed, when he wrote it, that I had stopped writing to him 4 years before. He did not know that I had written every week. She unfolded the letter. I will read the last paragraph. The room waited. I do not know if these letters reach you, she read. I have had nothing from England in 4 years, and I have begun to wonder whether you are well. I have begun to wonder whether you write. I tell myself that you write. I have decided to believe it, because the other thing is too large. I hope you are well, Mother. I hope Alice is growing. I hope you know that I think of you every Monday, because Monday was always the day you came back from the market, and I cannot think of Monday without thinking of you. She folded the letter and held it in both hands and looked at Sir Marcus Ray. He looked back at her. He was a man who had held a county's silence for 7 years through the simple mechanism of owning what people needed. And he sat in his chairman's seat and looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would help him. And he had not survived 11 years on the bench by saying things that did not help him. Then he gathered his papers. He stood, straightened his coat, and walked out of the Sessions House. The door at the back of the room opened and closed behind him, and the men on either side of him did not move. Forsyth looked at the bench. The young magistrate on the far right had stopped writing and was looking at his hands, which were still. The magistrate to Ray's left, the one who had given Prudence the floor, then said, "The charge of unlicensed vending is dismissed." He looked at Callender. "The libel action will not proceed. I will see to it this afternoon." Callender said, "Thank you. I have one more thing to ask," Prudence said. The room waited again. Ambrose Bassett kept those letters at considerable personal cost, she said. He has lost his daughters their positions. He came forward knowing what it would cost him further. I am asking this bench for a formal statement of his cooperation and a recommendation that he suffer no further professional consequence for his testimony today. She looked at Forsyth. He was a weak man in the grip of a powerful one. I know what that looks like. I have been watching it for 7 years. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Granted." The libel action was withdrawn by Friday. Prudence's license was restored the following Monday, the same day she would have posted her letter, if there had still been a letter to post. The pardon for Jonas Larkin, transported felon, son of Thurlow Green, cleared the Home Office on the 29th of October and caught the Eliza Ann at Deptford by 4 days. Jonas was free. He could not come home for 11 months, because free men still need passage money, and the wind takes what it takes. And the colony was not in the business of paying a man's way back to a country that had sent him away. He would work his passage. He would save what he earned. He would come home when he could, and not before. And Alice would meet her father at 8 and not 7, and nobody gave back the Mondays. Ray resigned the bench in November. He retired to Bath with his fortune untouched, because a county does not eat its own. It simply looks away when one of its own is asked to leave. Forsyth took the chair. The quarterly payments to Bassett's account ceased. The parish of Thurlow Green returned to Prudence's counter one at a time, beginning with old Caro, who came in on a Wednesday morning and bought a pennyworth of valerian and did not meet her eyes and put his coin on the wood and said, "I should have spoken." "Yes," she said, "you should have." She gave him his change. "Come back Thursday if it hasn't helped." She did not forgive them. She served them because they were her neighbors, and she was a woman who kept her shop. But she did not forgive them, and she did not pretend to. And they understood this and returned anyway, one at a time. Because her shop was the only apothecary in 4 miles, and because some of them, in the private dark of their own consciences, understood that the penance of being served without forgiveness was exactly the right size. She and Callender married on a Thursday in November, with the shop shut for 1 day. Alice wore her good dress and held the copybook during the ceremony because she had decided it should be there. The county did not receive Prudence as the new Baroness Callender. She did not require it. She opened the shop on Friday morning, and Callender stood behind the counter for an hour while she showed him which bottles were which. And he broke 1 jar of dried rosemary, reaching for it the wrong way, and she handed him a dustpan without a word, and he swept it up. And that was how they began. A Monday morning, 11 months on. The mist off the marshes was the same mist. Suffolk kept its weather faithfully. And the receiving house had a new keeper, a young woman named Holt, who had taken over from Bassett when he retired to his sister's house in Woodbridge. Prudence came in with her 6pence in the old motion, the coin in her palm, the step to the counter exactly as it had always been. And the new keeper looked up and said, "Mrs., my lady, there's a letter." Ship stamped, salt marked at the edges where the sea had found it in transit. Her name in a hand she had not seen in 8 years, the letters of it larger than she remembered. Jonas had grown into his handwriting, apparently, the way men grow into their shoulders. She did not open it there. She carried it home through the mist, the coin still in her pocket, and set it on the kitchen table. And Alice, 8 years old now, reading well. Her father's eyes and her grandmother's chin, and a new habit of sitting with her feet tucked under her that she had developed entirely on her own. Looked up from her breakfast and saw the letter and said, "Is that—" "Read it to me," Prudence said. Alice picked it up with both hands. She broke the seal carefully, the way she had been taught, and unfolded the pages, 3 of them, covered on both sides, the handwriting close and urgent. A man who had a great deal to say, and had been saving it for a long time. Alice read. The kettle went on the hob. Callender came in from the yard with mud on his boots and stopped in the doorway when he heard Alice's voice and stood there without sitting down, listening. And the kitchen was warm, and the mist was outside, and the letter was a ship-stamped, salt-marked, living thing in Alice's hands. When Alice reached the end of the last page, she set it down on the table and looked at her grandmother. Prudence looked at her husband, at the man who had stood in a receiving house queue one Monday morning, and asked the question nobody had been unkind or kind enough to ask her. The man who had ridden to Ipswich out of an inability to leave a wrong piece of paper alone. The man who had walked bareheaded across a rain-soaked green with his coat around a chest of letters. The man who had held her wrist in a library at 2 a.m. and waited for her to choose. He was watching her. and his face was open in the way that large, plain-spoken men's faces are open when they have stopped trying to find the right words and have simply let themselves feel the thing. She thought of the question he had asked her 11 months ago in the receiving house at Thurlow Green, in the mist. "Then, how do you know the letters arrive?" She answered quietly, "Yes." One word, the only one required. Later that morning, after Alice had gone to school with the letter folded in her coat pocket and Callender had gone out to the yard, Prudence went to the shop and unlocked the counter drawer and took out the copybook. She opened it to the last entry, Monday, 14th of September, the letter she had carried in the day the Baron asked his question, and turned to the next page. It was blank. She set the copybook open on the counter and put the pen back in the stand and left them there, the fresh page waiting in the morning light. She had nothing left she needed to record.